A summer fresh sunrise brought a new day, the 5th of July, 1944. The first morning rays danced on the meadows and wheat fields of a softly undulating landscape as we departed the perimeter of the forest. Barely 100 metres distant, a hill came into view, on which was perched a primitive wooden shed. I cautiously approached the structure with the point element, intending to brief my second-in-command of our next movement. Barely 30 metres from us, a tall Russian major suddenly sprang from the waist-high wheat with drawn pistol and shouted in broken German, "Surrender, Fritz! You're surrounded!" For only a heartbeat the air remained still, and without warning a burst from Feldwebel Uschakow's submachine gun soared across the major's breast. The air instantly filled with the roar of gunfire. Russian submachine guns fired on us from almost point-blank range. Hand grenades from both sides detonated around us, and we attempted to return fire while lying on the open ground. Still concealed in the forest barely 100 metres behind us and yet unseen by the Russians, the first 20mm flak opened fire, the rounds snapping viciously through the air above our heads. We could clearly see the tiny clouds of grey smoke as they exploded in the field before us. The second 20mm was soon brought into action, and taken by surprise by this overwhelming firepower that had suddenly surfaced in their midst, approximately 100 Russians fled before us to take cover in a protecting depression. The rifle companies swarmed to the right and left of the road, plunging forward through the green stalks of wheat. With the flak guns and the anti-tank gun in tow rumbling along the road, we pushed frantically toward the north. The seriousness of our situation, made desperate by our short-lived firefight, was apparent to every member of our group. I shouted over my shoulder to the men hurrying behind me, "Whoever wants to surrender can stay here. The rest of us will break through." There was no need to glance back toward our rear to know that no one remained behind as we urgently hurried on. In the early afternoon, we arrived near a settlement situated on a small rise that commanded the area. Dismissing the possibility that the village was occupied by the enemy, I prayed that from this location it was only a few kilometres to the Duna, where our lines would be. The settlement was defended with two aging but still formidable T-26 tanks, which, belching clouds of black smoke, manoeuvred to meet us with swinging turrets as we neared. Exhibiting great skill and bravery, Feldwebel Binow managed to get close enough to destroy one of them with a shaped charge. One of our flak guns received a direct hit in the engine, and I crouched alongside the smoking chassis while the gunner continued hammering with uninterrupted fire at the enemy. A crimson stream of blood running from the sleeve of his tunic. The second Russian tank ground to a halt, and as the crew attempted to abandon the vehicle, they tumbled to the ground under a hail of our small arms fire. We rose from our positions and stormed into the village, screams erupting from our throats as we opened fire and threw hand grenades into the cottages. A machine gunner barely 20 years old received a shoulder wound. Pausing long enough to grab the MG-42, I yelled for him to make his way toward the anti-tank gun so that they could take him aboard the self-propelled vehicle. Firing from the hip, I sprinted ahead with the others, and we broke through to the opposite side of the village. We plunged ahead, leaving the burning dwellings behind us, and we soon arrived at the next settlement. There were no Soviet soldiers to be seen, but the inhabitants had everything prepared to welcome their liberation by the Red Army. We were suddenly among them before they were able to recognize our ragged uniforms and camouflage-bedecked helmets, and they were leaning from the doorways and windows of the huts, cheering and waving bits of white and red cloth. The women had prepared to greet their liberators with bowls of sweet cream, and the excited children stood nearby with wooden spoons. Horrified, they suddenly realized that the heavily armed arrivals were not members of the Red Army, but were the enemy. Exhausted, hungry, and in torn uniforms caked with mud and sweat, we quickly downed the food and drink intended for our antagonists, otherwise ignoring the terrified inhabitants. As the sun descended on the horizon, we made our way closer toward our objective. Suddenly, from our right flank, we received a burst of machine gun fire that snapped harmlessly overhead, and in the distance along the edge of the road we could make out the distinctive helmets of a heavy machine gun crew crouching low behind their weapon. Our hearts pounding with elation, we drew cautiously nearer, calling to them in German. As we neared, they gazed at us with wide-eyed astonishment. While attempting the breakthrough back to our lines, the men of the rifle companies had requisitioned or captured pony carts into which the machine guns and wounded were now loaded. Some of the men were marching barefooted, their worn-out boots hanging across the backs of the horses. The uniforms were in tatters, white bandages stained with red-brown standing out starkly as a testament to the battles we had fought. The exhausted group entered the positions of the Oberst, who had been assigned to defend Muria. Surrounded by officers of his staff, he stood in an immaculate uniform next to a table at a small crossroads. A tent had been erected in the background. On legs trembling with weariness, I reported the return of my unit. A large map was spread on the table, and I attempted to show him our route of retreat. For 3 days and nights we had been constantly on the move, without a moment's rest, and my eyelids grew heavy as I directed him across the map. Suddenly, and without warning, the colonel began roaring at me in a manner such that I had not heard since the war school. I became instantly wide awake. As he berated me for my appearance and bearing, I found myself resisting the urge to toss the table and the map at him and the surrounding officers, some of whom were glaring at me grimly. Others appeared to suffer embarrassment at the outburst. He ended the tirade by requesting that I remove my dirty finger from his map and to use a twig of grass, if needed, for briefing him on our route. I ended the briefing abruptly and wordlessly departed their gracious company as quickly as possible. I returned to the ragged column of lancers standing in the dusty roadway, and we moved on. Despite our immense relief at having returned to our lines, we were overcome with an intense longing to be back with our old regiment, to be again in the company of our family. We were attempting to find the route to our unit when we spotted an artillery carriage with the circular tactical insignia of our division, and we knew in which direction we must march. The following morning, the 6th of July, we occupied a security line in the area of Druya, and in the course of the next several days we shifted our positions to cover a line 10 kilometers south of Druya-Antonovka-Sosnovka-Malinovka. On the 12th of July, we lay near Krasnogorka on Snudy Lake, before again launching an attack toward the south into the open Russian flank. This attack from 13 to the 19th of July carried us to Strusto Lake and Dundel near Plusy. On the 12th of July, the regiment was situated 50 kilometers southeast of Dunneberg, before a terrain feature that offered an excellent field of fire for our antagonists. I was with the 2nd Company in a depression that could be taken under fire from the nearby Soviet positions. During daylight hours we could barely show our heads from the muddy holes we had dug without drawing enemy mortar and small arms fire. We repeatedly requested artillery and assault gun support, as without this reinforcement it would be next to impossible to ever silence the guns that terrorized us. We were acutely aware that even to attempt to do so would result in disaster. Oberst Sepp Drechsel came to our rescue with Regiment 436. He had been given the assignment to close the gap between our division and our southern neighbour southwest of Plusy. To my immense relief, Uncle Sepp assumed leadership of both regiments, and with 2 assault guns at his disposal, the experienced commander pushed deep into the enemy flank. Following this action, we were able to storm the heights from our low-lying positions, overrun the Soviet positions, and push far to the south in the direction of Strusto Lake. This action afforded the Army Command a temporary and short-lived respite as a major part of the right wing of Army Group North, which a few days previously had been fighting on the western heights before Polotsk could be withdrawn to a less threatened area. For his initiative and action taken in stabilizing the situation on the southern wing, Oberst Drechsel was awarded the Knight's Cross, which he most highly deserved. On the 29th of July we moved to Aknista. We maintained our positions for a week, during which time Hauptmann Schmalfeld was killed, and I assumed command of the battalion. We were then ordered south, and the long columns of ragged Lancers wound their way to Stockmannshof in the Duna bridgehead. Here we remained, holding a thin line for almost 2 weeks before moving again, back toward the north and crossing the Duna over a wooden pontoon bridge. Following our crossing of the river, we attacked toward the north near Ergli. 20 July 1944. Count Klaus von Stauffenberg placed his bomb in the headquarters of the Führer to destroy the Brown dictator. Repercussions of this assassination attempt, the Attentat on the Supreme Commander of the German Wehrmacht and the greatest warlord of all time, were felt even on our foremost lines of the Eastern Front. Our decimated companies had been engaged in constant battle since the 30th of June 1944. The opportunity to sleep, to close our eyes and momentarily escape the horror, came by the hour, by the minute, by the second. We remained drained and exhausted. The environment had ravaged the Lancers physically and psychologically. The front demanded that each individual fight to survive from minute to hour. Then, in addition to the adversity and losses we were experiencing, came the news of the assassination attempt. Simple words cannot express the thoughts we held at the news of the attempt on the life of Hitler. For years we had continued to fight bitterly for the survival of our homes and our families, but as the rumours of the actual situation in our homeland increased, combined with the exhortations of the political leaders far from the guns, we began to further question the integrity of our leadership in Berlin. We had become painfully aware that our sacrifices, the years of constant exposure to suffering, deprivation and death, had left these leaders indifferent and emotionless to everything except whatever would benefit and enrich them as individuals. We began seeking and praying for an end to the conflagration into which so many millions had been thrust. A week later, I learned from the forward observers of an artillery regiment that the son of General Lindemann had been arrested by a field police unit. He had been assigned to an artillery regiment of the 132d Infantry Division, and when the news of the failed attempt on Hitler was announced, he was supposedly overheard saying, "Too bad that he isn't dead." He had then been denounced by one of his own men. It was confirmed that General Lindemann, our former commander, was a member of the resistance group, and it is highly likely that the arrest of his son was the result of the so-called Sippenverhaftung that was carried out zealously and without mercy by the men of the party. General Lindemann was an officer of the old school, an excellent leader of troops who had the refined mannerisms of an aristocrat. While serving as division commander, he had gone to great lengths to ensure that his troops received the best available care, and he had exhibited the most meticulous professionalism throughout the offences at Feodosia, Kerch and Sevastopol. He had always ensured that artillery, Luftwaffe, and all additional means of support were arranged and carried out to the utmost degree possible in order to reduce casualties. Several times during the fighting at Gaitalovo, he had risked his reputation and career by insisting that a delay or a rescheduling of an attack be implemented, in the face of much opposition from the higher command, after a careful study of the situation. This may have cost General Lindemann some prestige in Berlin. However, it certainly reduced the number of casualties that might have been incurred while ensuring the same successful results. It was also while under his command that the great Soviet offensives at Smerdina and Lake Ladoga were broken. And now it was revealed to us that General Lindemann was a member of a resistance group. From that moment, all reason for self-sacrifice, for loyalty to the country and to the National Socialist government, all the reasons with which we were constantly imbued for making the sacrifices on the front would be forever in question. This one act, more than any other factor, revealed to us that the war was lost. The knowledge that a number of our most talented and trusted military leaders would attempt to kill our head of state, albeit a ruthless dictator, proved to us that militarily we could not win against the massed combined might of the Allies. The one remaining factor that steeled us to fight ever harder was the knowledge that our Soviet enemy would show no commitment to civility or to the common laws of humanity should they invade our homeland. The other outcome of the attempt on the Führer's life was that it could not be denied, regardless of the lengths taken in justification, that Hitler, the one-time idol of millions, became in the eyes of many nothing more than a dictator in brown, who would take any sadistic and brutal measures against his political opponents. Our own commanders in the field, to whom we entrusted our lives and who controlled our destiny, fell among the ranks of his victims as well. In the eyes of the soldiers, the aura of the Führer was destroyed. The explosives placed by Oberst Count von Stauffenberg did not kill the dictator, but the act undermined, if it did not destroy, the idolatry that had been so carefully instilled and nurtured by the government throughout our youth. For some time, there had been National Socialist political officers assigned to military units. In the previous months and years, hardly anyone within the ranks on the front had taken them seriously. In the beginning, they were usually experienced, trusted veterans of the frontline units who, because of serious wounds, were no longer able physically to serve in the lines. Nevertheless, as the fortunes of the war began to turn, it became apparent to us that they increasingly came to resemble their counterparts in the Red Army, and they came to be known among the Lancers as politruks. Following the 20th of July assassination attempt, the military salute was changed. The traditional salute, universally recognized as bringing the hand to the cap visor or rim of the steel helmet, was now forbidden. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking military officer of our nation, deemed the Nazi Party salute as more appropriate for demonstrating the loyalty of the Wehrmacht to the ruling system. This party salute, the thrusting of an outstretched right arm forward, was observed with contempt and resentment by soldiers who honoured military tradition, and the order was taken as an insult by those who valued high standards and character. Indeed, in the eyes of the soldiers, the mandated use of this salute served to implicate them, to identify the soldiers with those enthusiastic members of the party who had developed a talent for sitting out the war at home, and it represented those who were now to be held in such contempt. Even prior to this order, within the military environment, this salute had been regarded as ridiculous and impractical. Following the order, it was not uncommon to observe entire companies carrying their mess tins in their right hands, to avoid being compelled to demonstrate their loyalty to the party. In view of the circumstances we were facing on the front, our concern for the politics of the attentat was short-lived. The average soldier on the front was so immersed in the difficulties of survival that little time was spent on brooding over its consequences. In later years, among circles of friends, we revealed to one another that the entire affair caused not a tear to be shed among us. Any sympathy for politicians, regardless of the situation, had been eliminated through years of deprivation and suffering on the front and during the endless months and years of captivity that followed. Above all, however, we were bound to our duty by the oath we had sworn as soldiers of Germany, to swear, with weapons in hand, to defend our country even to the sacrifice of our lives. Not even a change in command or policy could free us from this oath. The attentat was not necessarily considered by the soldier to be a betrayal, as through the natural course of events on the front, we had come to place our loyalty with our own, and thus differentiated between the armed forces and the brown-clad leaders in Berlin. It was 15 years later that I learned the story behind the death of our general, who, in my mind, had served as an extremely brave and talented division commander, a fine officer and an unforgettable leader in the memories of those who knew and served under him. The report of what had occurred was generously provided to me by the general's son and his widow, who had received the information in a letter from Frau Dr. Charlotte Pommer of the Staatskrankenhaus in Berlin. The general had taken refuge in the home of an architect in Berlin, a deed for which both the man and his wife paid with their lives. The government of the Reich had placed a bounty of 500,000 Reichsmarks for information leading to his capture, and the Gestapo was set in pursuit. According to the former German Red Cross nurse Gertrude Lux, General Lindemann had been shot by one of the Gestapo officials who brought him to the State Police Hospital, Berlin NW 40, Scharnhorststrasse 13, on the 3rd of September 1944. This particular official wore a ring bearing the initials AT or TA. She was informed that these security service officials, while serving under the direction of Kriminalrat Sader, had entered the residence on Reichskanzlerplatz, in which General Lindemann was hiding. After their arrival, the general managed to lock himself in a room on the uppermost floor, and then attempted to climb out the window onto the roof. The Gestapo official managed to kick in part of the door and quickly fired 2 shots toward the figure as he was attempting to climb through the window. At this point, the general obviously collapsed, and the official then asked if he had been hit, to which Lindemann replied, "Yes, I think twice." At 14:30, the general was brought to the hospital with a gunshot wound in his abdomen and a flesh wound in his upper thigh. The hospital staff was instructed to care for the wounds he had received during his arrest, and the handling of the patient was classified as top secret and was to be dealt with accordingly. While preparations were being made to care for his wounds, he took a seat on a stool and was then placed on an operating table where his right wrist was secured. He expressed concern about the binding of his hand, and it was explained to him that the precaution was normal procedure prior to surgery. An anesthesia was then intravenously administered, and as he slipped into unconsciousness, the general spoke in a loud voice. "I am General Lindemann. I am innocent. I am dying for Germany. Please greet my wife." The operation, which lasted 100 minutes, revealed that the colon had been penetrated twice, causing poisonous leakage that later infected his internal organs. The flesh wound in his upper thigh was tended as well. Following the operation, he was taken to room 116 of the surgical unit, where 2 Gestapo officials remained constantly on watch. While he was still under narcosis, both his hands were bound to either side of the bed. It was then arranged that an interrogation would take place when his condition would permit, and he was strong enough to withstand questioning. On the following day, the condition of the patient was much improved. The night nurse Gertrude Lux explained to the SD officials that the patient could not receive proper care as long as his hands remained bound, and managed to convince them to free the bonds during the morning and evening washing, which lasted for approximately an hour and a half. On the 4th of September, it was attempted through Frau Alexandra Roloff and Dr. Maria Dahlen to notify the relatives of the patient's status. On the 5th of September, the bonds were removed from his wrists, and a post-operative examination revealed that peritonitis had set in, which made any immediate interrogation inadvisable. Despite the seriousness of his wound, his circulation and blood pressure remained relatively acceptable. During the numerous air raid warnings with which Berlin was plagued at this time, he was removed from his room and taken to the operations bunker, and he noticed that the SD official went to lengths to ensure that he was always taken to a very safe area, probably as much for the security of the SD personnel as for the security of the general. One time when the SD guard momentarily left his charge alone with the nurse to relieve himself, General Lindemann asked her, "Nurse Gertrude, how is the situation at the front?" In view of the recent events, the nurse was unsure of how to respond to this curious question, and hesitantly asked, "Aren't you aware of what is happening to you?" "Of course, but it is not of importance, while so many are dying," he responded. On another occasion he thanked her for caring for him, and mentioned that he had 2 sons at the front. The isolated peritonitis developed into a general abdominal infection, and the general's condition began to worsen. On the 11th of September, a blood transfusion was ordered. At noon of the same day, the Gestapo personnel received a phone call to warn them that a plan to free the general could be in progress. For several days afterward, the SD officials kept a loaded pistol within quick reach on their night table. On the 13th of September, Professor Hoch, Chief Surgeon of State Hospitals, examined the patient in the surgical ward. When he introduced himself, General Lindemann simply closed his eyes and did not reply. The professor opened the wound and drained an abscess without administering anesthesia. The general did not speak or utter a sound during or after the examination. Following the examination, Professor Hoch contacted Kriminalrat Saad by telephone and explained to him that the condition of the patient was serious and that an interrogation must be conducted as soon as possible if they wished to gain any information at all from him. Following this conversation, Dr. Charlotte Pommer contacted Dr. Tietze, the director of the internal section of the hospital. It was decided that the patient would be given a large dose of Pantopon rather than the regular hourly application of circulatory medicine during the night. This decision was never put into effect, as approximately 1/2 hour later, more Gestapo officials appeared and interrogated the general, for a period of approximately 2 hours. On the evening of the 13th of September, news of his arrest was broadcast over the radio networks, and the next morning the incident first appeared in the newspapers. On the afternoon of the 21st of September, he was interrogated once again for a short period of time, and on that evening his condition worsened considerably. At approximately 3 o'clock, the 22nd of September, his blood pressure dropped, and about 2 hours and 15 minutes later he lost consciousness, never to awaken. Throughout his interrogation and during his internment at the hospital, he never expressed any outward sign of physical pain. After his death, his body was confiscated by the Gestapo, and his last resting place remains unknown. During the days of July and August, we became specialists in withdrawal and retreat, despite our lack of formal training in the practice of this art. The old Gefreiters thoroughly fulfilled their roles as the backbone of the battalions. Split up into small combat units, we were no longer routinely assigned to our own division, but were constantly shifted from unit to unit with seemingly little planning or organization. We became in large part reliant on our own ingenuity for supply and support, and we learned that any given situation was likely to change without warning. Earlier, it had been standard procedure to establish a proper supply and support organization whenever new positions were occupied, which would involve the prepositioning of ordnance and rations for all personnel, including a systematic plan for caring for the wounded. With the breakdown of the standard order of battle, such systematic planning was no longer possible, and we found it increasingly necessary to provide for ourselves without expecting or relying on support from the higher command. We had developed a sensitive, self-reliant intelligence network that could inform us of the general conditions of our front. On a large scale, the lack of mail deliveries for an extended period of time became a sure sign that another major catastrophe had occurred. From our frontline positions, it was not always possible to discern what might have been occurring several kilometers distant from our location, but as battle-hardened veterans, the Lancers could quickly assess the situation around them and instinctively become aware of impending disaster. From a distance, we could hear the heavy artillery barrages as the enemy prepared to strike a sector of the front, and from the far-off gunfire and the customary sound of throbbing engines and grinding of tracks associated with heavy armour, we could determine a breakthrough on our right or left flank, thus giving us only a few precious minutes hastily to prepare a withdrawal, the order for which would inevitably arrive at the last possible moment. In the early morning hours, I arrived at our new defence sector in the area of Dunneburg and set about establishing our defensive line and briefing the remains of the battle group and the 1st Battalion, Regiment 437. I was assisted by several NCO and Obergefreiters. Several hundred metres behind our position, we located a storage depot, where a supply Feldwebel was guarding a large cache of provisions that had not yet been transferred farther to the rear. We asked him if we could be permitted to draw some of the supplies for the use of the Lancers, and carefully advised him that within a few hours this very location would become the front lines, adding that from our experience the first mortar rounds would begin falling around midday. He replied that he would be more than willing to open his depot to us, as we still had sufficient time to distribute the goods to the combat troops, but added that he had been instructed to wait for a relief column to evacuate what he admitted were immense stores of flour, liquor and cigarettes. I immediately reported the situation to the battle group headquarters and requested instructions regarding the supply depot, but I received no decision or orders concerning the supplies. Meanwhile, our 2nd Company had begun arriving to occupy their positions before the depot, and word of the riches waiting to be taken spread like wildfire among the troops. The commander of the 2nd Company neared with his entourage of Lancers. As the supply Feldwebel hedged and hesitated, platoons of infantrymen began approaching in bleached, ragged uniforms and battered, camouflaged helmets, shielding their unshaven, sunburned faces. The dirty, grey-green columns came onward, battle-weary, with grenades in their belts, submachine guns swinging at their hips. The machine gunners appeared with long belts of linked 7.92 ammunition gleaming in the sun, and anti-tank rockets slung over their shoulders. The Feldwebel suddenly seemed to realise the full seriousness of the situation. The front was coming to him. He immediately leapt into his vehicle and disappeared toward the rear in a cloud of dust, abandoning the depot and its entire contents to us. The pony carts were quickly organised, and under the command of the machine gun company, the soldiers entered the depot to evacuate the stores. Huge quantities of cigarettes, food and liquor were removed and placed by the roadside, to enable the troops of other units to help themselves as they marched by. A large percentage of the supplies was distributed before late afternoon, when the depot came under the inevitable fire from the Russian artillery batteries and was destroyed. During the next several days, Obergefreiter Hohenadel, my former recruit commander, destroyed his 9th Soviet tank in close combat while serving as platoon leader with the 14th Infantry Panzerjäger Company. In the late afternoon, he had received the assignment to take 3 anti-tank stovepipe personnel up the road in a vehicle. This road marked the perimeter between them and the neighbouring division, and we were assigned to block the route to any enemy tanks that might attempt to use this road. Approximately halfway to the assigned point, they were met by a large number of infantrymen from the neighbouring division, who were withdrawing toward the rear, and they warned the 4 Lancers not to proceed farther up the road, as a column of Russian tanks was approaching. Heeding the warning, they were in the process of seeking a good defensive position when the transmission on the truck failed. With 2 of the men accompanying him, Hohenadel proceeded forward on foot. Rounding a curve in the road, they suddenly found themselves facing a number of Russian tanks a few hundred yards distant. In the evening dusk, the Obergefreiter could see that the tanks were piled high with heavily armed infantrymen, and the Lancers immediately dove into a hedge near the roadside, praying that they had not been seen. As the column neared, the Gefreiter with one of the stovepipes shouldered his weapon, took careful aim at the first tank, and scored a direct hit. The entire column instantly pulled to a halt, and infantrymen leaped from the tanks and poured into the thick undergrowth approximately 20 paces from Hohenadel's hidden location. Hohenadel opened fire on the group of Russians with his submachine gun. The almost point-blank range from which they were suddenly being fired on, combined with the growing darkness, resulted in momentary chaos within the enemy ranks. They returned the fire, but in the darkness the anti-tank crew had already sprinted to the other side of the road, where the other men were waiting, and the hand grenades thrown by the Russians exploded harmlessly on the position abandoned seconds earlier. The Lancers quickly shifted positions again and dove for cover in a roadside ditch. After several seconds, the column began moving again, and the Lancers were instructed to allow the first 2 tanks to pass before opening fire on the third. After several minutes, the column could be heard clattering toward them, and as the enemy ranks neared, one of the men fired his stovepipe and scored a direct hit on the lead tank, which immediately burst into flames. The remaining tanks held back and remained farther toward the rear, still accompanied by a large number of troops. Although greatly outnumbered, Hohenadel's group opened fire with machine pistols and assault rifles and charged onto the road. Despite the overwhelming odds against the Lancers, the Russians fled in panic. Meanwhile, the Lancers could hear more tanks approaching to within 100 meters of their location, and the next vehicle that they were able to observe in the flickering light of the already blazing tank was a Type Stalin, a 64-ton colossus that plunged into view from the protection of the darkness. Another stovepipe was fired, and to the Lancers' horror, the projectile struck the target but failed to penetrate the armour. Luckily, the tank halted, shifted into reverse, and retreated into the darkness. Hohenadel followed close behind with a Panzerfaust, after observing that the infantry had abandoned the vehicle when it had received the first hit. Making his way to within a few meters of the enemy vehicle, he fired the Panzerfaust at point-blank range. The head of the projectile penetrated the thick steel wall and detonated within the tank. It quickly began to burn, and explosions from the fuel and ammunition soon followed. A number of our own infantrymen arrived to reinforce the group, and they held the road until the following morning. This allowed enough time for the engineers to destroy an important bridge behind the tiny force, and with that move the enemy's attempt to drive a wedge between our 2 divisions along this road failed. Midsummer 1944. During the fighting south of Drissa-Druya, we attempted to link up with Army Group Centre's 3rd Panzer Army with a drive that took us 30 kilometres over the Duna. Despite all efforts, this attempt was in vain. On the 10th of July, a gap 25 kilometres wide was torn between our Army Group North and the devastated Army Group Centre. In the Bobruisk pocket, the Red Army destroyed 20 German divisions. This catastrophe could only be compared to the destruction of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, but the German propaganda machinery made little mention of the disaster other than to attempt to convince the population that this ignominious defeat was in reality a victory of sorts, even though with this enemy offensive, thousands of Germany's soldiers on the Eastern Front had fallen. Following this great victory against Army Group Center, the Soviet army held a triumphal march in Moscow. Later, while incarcerated as a prisoner of war, I met a number of the soldiers of this debacle who had survived and had experienced the subsequent march into captivity. The German survivors, those who had managed to remain alive following the surrender, were transported to Moscow. Many had died from thirst and exhaustion on the long journey, or, unable to continue due to wounds or sickness, had been summarily shot where they collapsed during the endless march. Eventually, the prisoners were collected in massive camps near Moscow in preparation for the victory procession. In order to strengthen the starving prisoners for the ordeal, they were fed a ration of grease-laden soup, which they devoured ravenously. In rows of 24 abreast, they were then compelled to file through Moscow. They marched past the Soviet generals on reviewing stands. The city population lined the streets by the thousands. The Allied embassy personnel and dignitaries were present as honorary guests, and the victory march was captured on film by journalists from all corners of the globe. After weeks of deprivation, the digestive systems of the prisoners were no longer tolerant of the fare rationed to them, and during the march through the city, the ragged columns became stricken with acute diarrhea, which served to weaken them to an even greater extent. Thousands of the Vojna plennies were unable to control their tortured bowels throughout the victory parade, and later in the United States, a film was released showing the filth of the fascist invaders being cleaned from the streets of Moscow as an example of the agony of defeat. During ancient times, it was common for the victorious forces to parade their prisoners through Rome or Carthage. The prisoners would become slaves of the victors, but there was nevertheless often a semblance of protection through laws and basic rights. In the 20th century, prisoners were often afforded little or no protection in any form and remained free game for the victors. One could beat them, work them to death, shoot them, or simply let them starve. It was widely accepted within the ranks of those fighting in the East that death on the battlefield was preferable to an unknown destiny in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. This mentality often played a role in the many acts of bravery demonstrated by individuals or entire units. During the closing days of the war, it was not at all uncommon for entire companies, battalions, and battle groups to fight to the last man, the survivors going into captivity only when ammunition was exhausted and wounds were too grave to allow further resistance. In July, a massive force of 29 Russian infantry divisions and an armoured corps of the 1st Baltic and 3rd White Russian Front pushed through the gap in the defences of Army Group Central and streamed westward toward the Baltic Sea. With this thrust, the fate of Army Group North, composed of 23 German divisions, was sealed. These doomed divisions, isolated and totally cut off from Germany, were later to be designated Army Group Kurland and would hold out against overwhelming odds until the bitter end. Iergelai. In July 1944, the front of the army group in the south ran west of Schaulen to Mittau. The Soviets succeeded in pushing 20 divisions through this line, and on the 29th of July they arrived at Tukum and were then standing on the Baltic Sea. Although the German divisions fought bitterly at Aknista, on the Duna bridgehead at Stockmannshof, and in the area of Ergli, they were nevertheless severed from the only possible land route to Germany. In August, General Graf Strachwitz attempted to recapture Tukum behind us with his panzer group. On the 20th of August, he succeeded in taking this strategically important sector, and for the moment we breathed more easily. This victory was recognized as an overwhelming accomplishment, not only for Graf Strachwitz and his panzer crews, but also for the sailors of the cruiser Prinz Eugen and escorting destroyers and torpedo boats, who had bombarded the Russian positions at Tukum from the sea. On 21 and the 22nd of August, we attacked the town of Ergli with the weakened 1st Battalion of Regiment 437. Near the banks of the Oga, we captured the forward positions and assaulted the Russians through the cemetery of Ergli. We sought shelter between the gravestones as we came under mortar and artillery fire, with shrapnel hissing and smashing against the stone memorials where we lay. Knowing that to remain at this location was to invite imminent death or wounding, Volley and I fired our submachine guns on the run as we advanced with the battalion staff through the barrage. A short distance ahead, a row of underbrush offered cover, and I dodged through the grave markers toward the concealment, when suddenly, from no more than 2 paces, I was surprised by a set of wide eyes staring from under a round, olive-coloured Russian helmet. Our eyes seemed to lock on one another's for an eternity. Instinctively, I managed to shout a quick, "Stoi!" and the Russian sergeant's submachine gun clattered at my feet. Volley, only a few meters distant, rapidly kicked a grenade that landed near him into the underbrush and captured a Russian private who stumbled forward, hands above his head. A cursory search of the area revealed that the sergeant had a field telephone hidden in the row of bushes, and Gefreiter Treiber from the battalion staff took it for our own use, but not before dialing the Soviet unit at the other end of the communications cable and shouting, "Fritzen here, yes!" into the telephone as they came on the line. The communications wire disappeared into the undergrowth, revealing to us the direction in which we needed to advance. The Russian sergeant had been directing the mortar and artillery fire that had threatened to cut off our attack, and with his capture his unit could no longer receive information regarding our movement or position. We called in 80mm mortar fire, as well as 150mm artillery support from the 13th Artillery Battery, on the commanding height southeast of Ergli, and behind this curtain of fire we assaulted the hill with 50 men. Volley, a former artillerist who had served with the 132d Artillery Regiment in the Crimea, established liaison between our location and 2 of our division's batteries that had taken up positions behind Ergli during the night. As a means of holding the heights against overpowering opposition, we developed a new but dangerous tactic. With only a weakened means of defence, it was obvious that we would not be able to hold our positions without the unfailing support of the artillerists. During the night, we would establish 2 machine gun posts forward of the crest. As dawn began to break, we would evacuate these positions, withdrawing the lancers to the lee side of the height, approximately 200 metres from the crest. Predictably, the Soviets would advance in the wake of our withdrawing units, and as soon as we observed the first Russian helmets appearing on the crest of the heights, I would order 105mm barrages directly on our previous positions. This was unfailingly successful in driving the enemy back to their line, and in the evening light we would again occupy the positions. In this manner, we were able to hold our positions on Egg Hill before Ergli for nearly 2 weeks. In the last days of August, Lieutenant Steinhardt reported to us with 80 men from the Luftwaffe as reinforcements for the battalion. They were assigned to Grenadier Regiment 438 and adjusted quickly to their new role as infantrymen, proving themselves reliable and brave fighters. Throughout this period, we maintained an excellent relationship with the regimental commander Oberst Siertz and his adjutant, Hauptmann von Deimling. In the closing days of August, we were pulled back to serve as the regimental reserve to the old Ergli estate. After a long period of fighting rearguard actions, we had finally been placed under the command of our old regiment again. It was now commanded by one of the old hatchets from Regiment 436, Major Oxner. He had heard of our defence of Egg Hill, and he approached us as I and 120 men from the battalion lay resting in the churchyard of Ergli. He greeted me warmly, and with his arm about my shoulders, we spoke briefly of old times that we had both enjoyed with the regiment. It remained unsaid, but we remained fully aware that in all likelihood we were approaching our last and final battlefield. As we spoke of so many of our comrades that now lay buried in Russian soil, he paused long enough to gaze on the tattered, filthy survivors lying on the earth exhausted, and with moist eyes he suddenly turned and departed. The days of the Heldenklau descended on us. The rear support personnel were being rounded up in ever greater numbers and pressed into service as infantry. Luftwaffe personnel still wearing their blue-grey uniforms and without a single day's training in infantry tactics and only cursory instruction in the use of automatic weapons, found themselves reporting to us, fully unprepared yet willing to face an ever stronger enemy. For those in the rear, far from the Russian guns, the term transferred to the infantry had taken on a new, ominous meaning. The threat of serving in the front lines, where the mortar and artillery rounds burst, where snipers considered killing the unwary as a rewarding but deadly sport, and where men slaughtered one another routinely from almost within arm's reach, was enough to make the blood run cold in the veins of many a rear echelon warrior. The phrase punitive transfer was heard among the troops more often. This term was regarded with disgust and contempt by the older infantry veterans and survivors of many battles, and the practice as a penalty for a perceived or real infraction served to promote ill feelings between the battalion veterans and those troops who had been transferred to us for disciplinary reasons. As that became more commonplace, the professional infantrymen were obliged to ask themselves if the years spent in the foremost lines, the deprivations suffered, and the horrors experienced had been regarded as nothing more than a disciplinary action. There was one Generaloberst in particular, whose highly esteemed rank insignia could, in the minds of those who had personally experienced his peculiar style of leadership, only be credited to the golden party badge he wore, and to his philosophy of placing his loyalty to the National Socialist Party above his loyalty to the troops whose lives were entrusted to him. Generaloberst Schörner made a practice of punishing Lansers, non-commissioned officers, and officers with immediate transfer to the infantry for any insignificant infraction. It was generally agreed that this high-ranking gentleman obviously understood nothing of the code of honour held by the German infantry. By sending offenders to the infantry as a form of punishment, he contributed to the degradation of the soldiers' willingness to sacrifice themselves for what they had been taught was right and just. One evening, a non-commissioned officer, trained as a weapons specialist, reported to me for duty from battalion headquarters. He informed me that he was reporting as ordered by the Generaloberst and was to be demoted in rank and placed in the foremost lines. The following day we received the punitive report carefully printed as an official document bearing the letterhead of Army Group North, signed by the Generaloberst with an oversized S as the initial for Schörner. This highly trained Feldwebel had been a precision toolmaker by profession, had attended the Army Weapons School, and as such could be considered an irreplaceable asset to his battalion. The Generaloberst, so he explained, was not concerned with how the battalion would keep its machine guns and assault rifles in repair, but with the idea that discipline must be maintained and that infractions would be severely punished. The perceived infraction had occurred when this Feldwebel was en route to a rearward weapons depot to obtain urgently needed parts for his unit's weapons. He had been riding on the running board of a regimental vehicle when he observed a high-ranking general at a crossroads, and he had dutifully leaped from the vehicle to report. He removed his pipe with his left hand and held it at his side as he rendered the customary salute. He was unable to put the pipe in his uniform pocket, as it was lit and would thus burn his tunic. As he saluted, the general demanded to be shown the item he was holding in his hand. He showed the officer with crimson and gold collar insignia his pipe, and was immediately told to toss it away. The Feldwebel then dutifully tapped the pipe against the sole of his boot and quickly stuck it into his tunic pocket, an action that would have been considered perfectly acceptable by any reasonable officer. For this grave offence he was to be punished. He remained with us for several days at battalion headquarters, where he found employment repairing and refurbishing our battle-worn weapons. Almost 1 week later I was approached by a one-armed staff officer who appeared unexpectedly at our headquarters. This lieutenant had been assigned the unenviable task of confirming that the sentence of the soldier involved in this incident was indeed being carried through. It was at this time that I made my first and only false report during my entire military experience. The man was killed in action 2 days ago. The officer then disappeared, and I never regretted the false report. It was the duty of every officer to ensure the welfare of his men, and I considered the Feldwebel's skill and his ability to keep our weapons in the best working order to be far more valuable to the war effort than simply to obey this preposterous order. During the last weeks, the division had been pulled back over the Russian-Baltic border, and once again we had European soil under our feet. The area had served as a geographic buffer for centuries between Central and Northern Europe, as well as between east and west. To the casual observer, the softly undulating terrain renders a peaceful atmosphere. The hilltops are loosely crowned with pines, maple, and oak. The shallow valleys are carpeted with grass, damp moor, and small lakes surrounded with birch trees. The landscape is interspersed with small, fast-moving streams that flow into the Duna River, which meets the Baltic Sea at Riga. The inhabitants were primarily engaged in farming or forestry. The earth is fruitful, and for Eastern Europe the climate is comparatively mild. Cattle, pigs, and sheep are raised in abundance, and the people live in wooden houses with a large living quarters, a bathing room, and solidly built barns for the animals. Large, well-constructed cellars are usually built in close proximity to the houses. During the fighting in the areas of Stockmannshof, Aknista, and Ergli, and from Riga to Kurland, we used the cellars for battalion and company headquarters when possible. The local estates, somewhat smaller than those of their Prussian cousins to the west, are scattered throughout the land, with villages alongside primitive roadways that are constructed more for use by horse-drawn carts than for motorized vehicles. Although the farm and village dwellings display a distinctive Eastern architecture, the larger structures in the cities and towns are of definite German design. The cities contain churches and public buildings of Lower German Baroque style from the Middle Ages. The peaceful landscape with clean homes, villages and towns reminded us of our own homeland, to the extent that it made our current situation, being severed and isolated from our familiar surroundings and families, somewhat easier to bear. The field kitchens welcomed supplies of fresh vegetables, new potatoes and pork, and the supply officers and each company's spies strove to enhance their reputations as they competed with one another to provide the best possible provisions to the soldiers at the front. The last days of August found the battalions and regiments of the 132d Infantry Division engaged in battle west of Modon and near Ergli, against an enemy immensely superior in material and manpower. Following this heavy fighting, it was necessary to disband the 437th Grenadier Regiment due to the heavy losses suffered without hope of replacements. On the 14th of September, the last commander of Regiment 437, Major Oxner, holder of the Knight's Cross, was killed in action at Ergli. During the war in Russia, he had been wounded no less than 8 times and had hardly recovered from his most recent wounds when he met his fate on the battlefield. At the beginning of September, Hauptmann de Dell assumed command of the battalion. He was a genuine Bavarian, with a sense of humour and a strong athletic build. He was known for his short-stemmed pipe, which he referred to as his nose-warmer. I remained on the staff serving as battalion adjutant, and Wolle was assigned duties as the ordnance officer. Gerd Perner was our medical officer, and the machine gun company was commanded by the blonde Hauptmann Fred Fuchsius, whom we had nicknamed Peer Gint. The few survivors within our old circle of friends had become inseparable, and only wounds or death could break the bonds of comradeship among us. It must be said that this remained the only positive aspect that we experienced during our total war. Following the dispersal of Regiment 437, the units were reassigned to the staff, to the 13th Infantry Company, to the 14th Panzerjäger Company of Grenadier Regiment 436, and to Infantry Regiment 438. Only one Grenadier battalion remained intact, and it was permitted to continue carrying the designation 2 Grenadier Battalion, Infantry Regiment 437, although it was now assigned to Infantry Regiment 436. Those of us from the 437th took pride in continuing to wear our old numerical designation. The regimental commander of 436, Knight's Cross winner Oberst Sepp Drechsel, was one of the few commanders to have fought through both world wars and survived. He had a sterling reputation for the absolute fairness and loyalty he consistently exhibited to his troops. He was a commander with a rare talent for knowing when the situation required a stern disciplinarian, or when permissiveness could be accepted. The troops referred to him unofficially as Papa Drechsel, and those with a close relationship to him often took the liberty of calling him Uncle Sepp. The new officers and men immediately developed an excellent relationship with him. Once again, we narrowly escaped disaster. On the 14th of September, enemy forces heavily supported by armour broke through our right flank. They pushed onward, and on the 16th of September they bypassed Ergli, thus severing us from the main body of forces in the west. With this serious development, it was no longer possible to hold our positions, so once again we broke through the encirclement and occupied the heights to the west of Ergli. We held these positions for a number of days. The leaves in the trees began to take on the hue of autumn. In long columns we marched westward along the cobblestone roads, capturing ground further to the west, as our withdrawal was jokingly referred to with a soldier's gallows humour. Despite the losses we had suffered in breaking the Soviet ring that had recently closed around us, we continued to conduct an orderly retreat as we drew ever closer to the sea, from where we could withdraw no farther. Far to the north, the Russians had launched their offensive at the end of September between Narva and Pleskau. This offensive forced the withdrawal of all German forces north of the Duna, and the plans for the evacuation of Riga were set into motion. The long march marking our final retreat to Courland had begun. Riga is the ancient seat of the Order of Hanseatic Knights. We were provided the dubious distinction of observing the once beautiful city at our backs, experiencing its death throes. The primitive roads were choked with the dusty columns of trucks and tanks. Lines of refugees with wagons and handcarts piled high with belongings filed through the Latvian capital day and night. The bellowing of confused and weary herds of cattle filled the air as they were driven westward over the brick-paved streets. The foreboding sight of Russian fighter bombers became a constant reminder of our dire situation as they screamed over the tiled rooftops, the five-pointed red star clearly visible on the shining silver fuselages. Autumn 1944 brought wind, rain, and cold nights. As we had so often experienced wherever the war had taken us, many of the roads had again become bottomless mires. Exhausted, incessantly hungry, and always cold, the men mechanically withdrew from one position to the next line of defence. The only relief from the hounding enemy would arrive with the setting sun, when the encroaching darkness would shield us from the relentless eyes of death. The enemy forces who quickly followed any withdrawal would fill the void after our departure, swarming in endless numbers through the towns and villages. The clusters of infantry piled high on the giant T-34 tanks, the raging artillery, and the low-flying aircraft would seek out our next line of defence, and again we would halt and turn to face our relentless pursuers. October 1944. Operation Thunder, the final withdrawal of the German forces to Courland and the evacuation of Riga, was carefully planned by the staff of Army Group North. At the beginning of October 1944, General Major von Natzmer signed the order that would concentrate the German forces remaining in the Baltic region into our final battlefield. On the 5th of October, Operation Thunder was put into motion. As the operation was executed, the 132d Infantry Division held its positions southeast of Riga. Beginning on the 6th of October, an entire army filed westward behind us and marched through the city and over the Duna bridges. The army group was able to hold only a narrow corridor 45 kilometres long and 6 kilometres wide between Riga and Schlock, which offered the only passage to Courland. All refugees and military units withdrawing before the Red Horde were compelled to cross the Duna and Aya within this stretch of territory. It was necessary for 2 divisions, plus a mixture of various splintered units, to pass daily through this gauntlet, which had been within range of indirect Soviet artillery fire since the first days of October. The operation was a masterpiece in terms of planning and organisation, and this planning was composed by the able General Major Frankiewicz of the 215th Infantry Division. His forces provided 1,000 officers and men for organisation and control of the columns, which slowly but methodically wound their way toward Courland. Some officers from the reserve were assigned to maintain control during the evacuation, and Gustl Hickel informed me later that stringent measures were taken in an effort to maintain a flow of traffic and to save as many lives as possible. Any vehicle, regardless of whether the occupants were high-level staff officers or ragged Lancers, that became disabled due to aircraft strafing or artillery barrages, or that simply had run out of fuel, was unceremoniously pushed off the road to sink into the marshes lining the roadsides. Any abandoned equipment was destroyed to deny its use to the enemy, and pony carts piled high with wounded, intermingled with civilian refugees. The flotsam of war creaked slowly toward the sea in a vain effort to escape the Red Army. Cool and sombre, the night of 12th–13th of October settled on the men occupying the machine gun and infantry positions in the suburbs of Riga. As a drizzling rain began to fall, the last infantrymen with our battalions, which had received the dubious distinction of serving as a rearguard, finally wound their way through the burning city. At the approach to the large Duna Bridge, General Wagner, commander of the 132d Infantry Division, stood silently together with Papa Drexel. They wordlessly observed the field-grey forms filing past, the steady rhythm of worn boots on the cobblestones, broken only by the occasional clank of a rifle barrel or submachine gun against a mess tin or helmet hanging from the heavy leather field belts. The flames rising in the heart of the city from the opera house danced against a black sky, casting ghostly shadows on the grey columns treading over the ancient bridge as a once-conquering army withdrew in tatters. At exactly 0:30, my column approached the Duna Bridge spanning the river, which appeared black and forbidding in the night. At the head of those troops entrusted to me to guard the battalion withdrawal, I knew we represented the last forces of the German Wehrmacht to cross from east to west over the Duna in Riga. Nearing the two solitary figures whose dim silhouettes were visible on the bridge against the flickering light of a dying city, I drew to a halt and saluted. After a brief pause, during which we watched the ragged column pass in silence, the last general, major, and lieutenant passed to the other side. It suddenly occurred to me that at this very spot, 25 years earlier, Schlageter had stood with his cannon in a valiant struggle to prevent the Red Revolution from sweeping through the old Ordensland. At 5 o'clock, the dawn brought a wet and cold day. As the sun attempted to penetrate the thick grey horizon, an officer from a pioneer unit pushed the charging handle of an electric blast machine wired to the demolitions placed within the Duna Bridge. A gigantic ball of flame shot into the air over the river, and the atmosphere was rent by an enormous explosion as the bridge finally collapsed into the Duna, severing us once again from the Soviet army. Some 100 meters distant, a ferry carrying the last remnants of the rear guard was completing its crossing of the river. As the bridge sank into the swiftly moving current with a roar, large pieces of stone rained on the vessel, striking and severely injuring some of the withdrawing soldiers. Thus Operation Thunder had reached its ominous end.